The Johnson property sat on the edge of a small southern town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's secrets, or at least thought they did. Life there moved slowly, like honey dripping from a jar, and the past lingered in the air with the weight of generations. On the back lot of the old wooden house, behind the sagging porch and the worn fence, there grew a massive oak tree that overshadowed everything around it. Its trunk was thick and scarred, its roots twisting across the ground like sleeping serpents. Its branches reached so high that when the afternoon sun leaned toward the west, the oak's shadow swallowed half the neighborhood. It was not just a tree. It was a presence, a monument, and for some, almost a warning. The house belonged to Thomas Ray, a man whose dark skin had weathered both war and the hardships of life in the segregated South. He was known throughout Greenville for his stern face, deep voice, and the way he commanded respect without ever needing to raise his hand. Thomas was not cruel, but there was a gravity about him that kept people at a distance. Even in his later years, when his back bent and his hair turned silver, he still carried himself like a soldier who had never left the battlefield. Men in town lowered their eyes when his gaze caught theirs. Even the young men, who normally had little respect for elders, never dared mouth off to Thomas Ray. Yet, for all his sternness, there was something mysterious about him, something no one quite understood. It centered on that oak tree. From as far back as anyone could remember, Thomas had never let anyone near it. Neighbors who came by with offers to prune it or trim its wild branches were dismissed sharply. His sons had been scolded for playing too close to its roots. And when his grandson Daniel came along, a boy who would grow into a farmer with soil under his fingernails and shoulders broad from years of work, he quickly learned the oak was off limits. No climbing, no touching, not even leaning against its trunk. It was as though the tree was sacred ground. Thomas never called it holy, but he never explained himself either. Daniel remembered vividly a day when he was no older than 6. The summer heat had been stifling, cicadas shrill in the branches above, and the oak looked to him like a fortress waiting to be conquered. He had barely wrapped his hands around the bark when Thomas's voice thundered across the yard. "Get away from there!" Daniel froze. He turned to see his grandfather striding toward him, cane in one hand, fury in his eyes. Thomas pulled him back with such force he nearly fell. The grip on his arm was unyielding, but what Daniel never forgot was the look in the old man's eyes. Not just anger, fear, raw, deep fear. Thomas Ray, who feared no storm, no man, no authority, was terrified of what lay under that tree. The neighbors talked, as small towns do. Some whispered that Thomas had buried money from his work on the railroads. Others said darker things, that something terrible had happened there long ago, some crime too heavy to name. Boys dared each other to sneak into the yard at night and touch the oak, but most lost their nerve. Those who tried never lingered long enough to brag. The tree seemed haunted, and Thomas was its grim guardian. For Thomas himself, the tree was an anchor. On quiet evenings, he would sit beneath it, sometimes with his pipe, sometimes with nothing but silence, his lips moving as though he spoke to someone unseen. Daniel, peeking from the window, once asked his grandmother what Thomas said out there. She only shook her head. "Leave him be. That tree is his business." Thomas never spoke of his years in uniform. He never spoke of the marches that had swept through towns like theirs in the 60s. His medals stayed tucked in a drawer. His photographs were hidden in boxes. The oak was the only thing that held him year after year, as though it carried a part of him no one else could reach. When storms tore through Greenville and neighbors offered to help trim the oak, Thomas refused. "That tree stands as it is," he would say firmly. And it did. Through lightning, through wind, through the relentless Mississippi heat. People muttered about it being unnatural, but no one pressed Thomas again. Daniel grew into a man, his life bent to the rhythms of the land. He worked the fields, raised his boy Matthew, and kept the family homestead in shape. His younger brother Samuel lived nearby, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a sharp laugh that carried over the sound of his tools. But no matter how far Daniel stepped into his own life, the oak was always there, looming, untouchable, and heavy with silence. When Thomas's health failed and cancer pinned him to his bed, Daniel visited often. He sat at the bedside, watching his grandfather's once iron frame shrink into frailty. Again and again, the question rose in his throat. What was under the oak? Why had his grandfather guarded it with his life? But each time, the words died on his tongue. He told himself there would be time, on a better day, when the pain eased. That day never came. Thomas Ray passed one spring morning. Greenville turned out for the funeral. Men and women lined the yard, speaking low, their eyes flicking to the oak, as though expecting it to topple now that its guardian was gone. It didn't. It stood taller than ever, branches swaying in the light breeze, as if waiting. Daniel stood by the grave with his teenage son Matthew, feeling the weight of silence. For the first time, the oak seemed to stare back. After the funeral, the house passed to Daniel. He moved in with Matthew, determined to carry on. Samuel came often, helping patch the roof, repairing fences, tinkering with the old tractors that always seemed to break down at the worst times. They made the place livable, but the oak refused to fade. Its shadow stretched over every chore, every meal at the kitchen table. Every evening, Daniel spent staring through the window. Nights were hardest. He sat where Thomas once sat, watching the silhouette of the oak against the moon. He wanted to believe it was just a tree, but it wasn't. It had never been. As months passed, the oak revealed itself to be more than a symbol. Its roots bulged against the foundation of the shed, cracking the cement. Branches hung heavy over the roof, threatening to fall in the next storm. Acorns and leaves littered the yard in an endless cycle. It was a hazard, plain and simple. One hot afternoon, Daniel stood with Samuel in the yard while Matthew tossed a baseball against the fence. "It's got to come down," Daniel said quietly. Samuel wiped grease from his hands, squinting at the crown. "That tree's been here longer than any of us. Shame to cut it." "Shame don't keep the shed standing," Daniel replied. "And it won't keep Matthew safe if one of those limbs falls." Samuel studied him, brow furrowed. "You sure you want to cross a line Grandpa drew with his own hands?" Daniel hesitated, the memory of Thomas's grip still etched into his skin, but he nodded. "I'm sure." That night a storm rattled the windows, bowing trees until they moaned like ships. In the morning, Daniel saw a branch as thick as a man's waist split and hanging over the shed. That was the final sign. He called the crew. The truck rolled into the yard 2 days later, heavy tires crunching the gravel. Greenville was a small town, and nothing happened without eyes watching. Neighbors leaned against porch rails, curtains twitched, and a few men paused at the corner store to see what was going on. The crew that climbed out looked like they had spent their lives wrestling with timber, broad-shouldered, sunburned, their boots leaving prints like cattle hooves in the dirt. They studied the oak with professional eyes. One let out a low whistle. "Biggest one I've seen all year," he muttered. Another asked Daniel if he was certain. Daniel nodded. His stomach knotted, but his voice stayed steady. "It's got to go." Matthew stood by the porch, baseball still in hand, his young face tight with curiosity. Samuel had crossed his arms, silent, his jaw set in a way that said he didn't like this, but wouldn't stand in the way. The first bite of the saw rang out like a gunshot. Daniel flinched. The roar of chainsaws filled the yard, spewing golden sawdust into the air. The oak shuddered, its massive branches trembling as though the sound itself were alive. Neighbors muttered from across the fence but didn't intervene. Even they knew some things weren't theirs to decide. Hours passed in a blur of labor. Ropes were tied, wedges hammered, saws bit deep into the trunk that had stood for generations. The scent of fresh oak filled the air, sharp and heavy. Sweat streaked the workers' brows. Daniel's shirt clung to his back, though he hadn't lifted a tool. He couldn't shake the guilt rising in him, the sense that each cut tore not just into wood, but into something older, something sacred. He remembered his grandfather sitting under those branches night after night, whispering words only the oak seemed to hear. He remembered the thunder in Thomas's voice the day he tried to climb it as a boy. Get away from there. Even now the echo returned, sharp and heavy. When the final cut came, the crew shouted warnings. Ropes strained. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. The oak groaned, a sound so deep it rattled Daniel's chest. Then, with a crash that shook the earth, it toppled. Branches split, birds scattered in a frenzy of wings, and dust billowed into the sky. The oak lay sprawled like a fallen beast, its limbs broken, its crown shattered. For a moment, silence claimed the yard. Daniel stood frozen, heart hammering, his mouth dry. He half expected to hear his grandfather's voice again, demanding to know what he had done. But there was nothing. Only the cicadas singing in the heat, and the sound of the crew shouting to each other as they began trimming the limbs. Neighbors drifted back to their homes, some shaking their heads, others whispering. Daniel barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the base of the oak, where the roots had torn the earth open. The stump jutted from the ground like a broken tooth, its rings exposed to the sunlight for the first time in centuries. The roots twisted through the soil like veins, and in the middle of that tangle, Daniel saw it, something dark pressed against the dirt. At first he thought it was a stone. Then the color sharpened, black plastic. His pulse spiked. He glanced at the crew. They were busy with the branches. Samuel stood a few feet away, watching. Daniel crouched, clawing at the soil with calloused fingers. Dirt crumbled away to reveal more of the plastic, stretched taut, its edges torn but intact. A bag. "Sam," Daniel whispered. His brother stepped closer, brows knitting. Daniel dug faster until the sack was free. It was large, bound with an old cord. The plastic was filthy, stiff with age, but unmistakably deliberate. This had been buried. This was what Thomas had guarded with his life. Daniel sat back on his heels, chest pounding, staring at the thing. The weight of years pressed down on him. He tugged at the cord. It resisted, then gave way with a snap. The smell hit him first. Earth, rust, something faintly metallic. Inside lay a revolver, heavy and cold, its surface flecked with rust. Daniel lifted it out, hands trembling. It felt wrong in his palm, foreign, yet familiar. He set it down quickly, as if it burned. Next came a small box of tarnished bullets, a knife with a worn wooden handle, and bundles of letters tied with twine so old it nearly disintegrated in his hands. At the bottom was a bundle wrapped in cloth, stiff with age. Daniel pulled it free and felt the chill sink into his bones. The cloth was stained dark, the color of old blood. His stomach lurched. He dropped it, breath ragged. Matthew had edged closer, eyes wide, but Samuel held him back with an arm across his chest. "Stay there, boy." His voice was low, shaken. Daniel forced himself to reach deeper. His fingers brushed leather. He pulled out a journal, its cover cracked and swollen from years underground. The handwriting inside was Thomas's, strong, slanted letters Daniel recognized instantly. The words on the first page blurred as his vision swam. He steadied himself, forcing his eyes to focus. The entries spoke of nights in Greenville, when men marched down streets lined with hatred, of voices raised, of clubs swinging, of blood spilled on sidewalks. But beneath the stories of marches and speeches, the words darkened. They spoke of meetings in secret basements, of men arming themselves because they felt they had no other choice. They spoke of shadows, of violence, of names that had vanished from town history but lived on in Thomas's ink. One entry stopped Daniel cold. It spoke of a police officer known for his brutality, a man Daniel dimly remembered hearing about when he was a boy. The journal didn't confess outright, but between the lines, the truth lay waiting. That man had disappeared, and Thomas knew why. Daniel shut the journal quickly, chest heaving. The revolver lay beside him, silent, heavy. The cloth bundle seemed to pulse in the corner of his vision, whispering a truth he didn't want to face. Behind him, Samuel whispered, "Lord have mercy." Daniel looked up at him, then at Matthew, who stood pale and silent, his boyish face caught between fear and fascination. For years, Thomas had sat under the oak, guarding this secret. Now it lay open, and Daniel felt the weight of it pressing on his chest like a stone. The workers called out, asking if everything was all right. Daniel forced a shaky smile. "Yeah, just checking the roots." They shrugged and went back to their saws. Samuel crouched beside him, voice low. "What are we going to do with this?" Daniel didn't answer. He tied the sack closed again, though his hands trembled. He lifted it carefully, dirt falling away from its sides. The bag was heavy, not just with weapons and papers, but with the weight of a life his grandfather had fought to keep buried. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. The house was silent, except for the muffled sound of chainsaws outside. Daniel sat heavily in the chair where Thomas had once sat, staring at the bag, unable to move. Matthew broke the silence. "Pa, was Grandpa a bad man?" The question pierced Daniel's chest. He stared at his son, words caught in his throat. "No," he said finally. though his voice was low. He was a man who carried more than he could ever tell us. Samuel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes hard. And now it's on us. Daniel waited until the crew finished limbing the fallen giant and the chainsaw noise faded down the street. The house settled into a hush that felt almost ceremonial. He unknotted the bag and laid the pieces of Thomas's hidden life across the kitchen table. Letters in careful stacks, photographs smoothed as best he could, the revolver wrapped now in a dish towel, the knife sealed inside a freezer bag, the blood-dark cloth isolated in another. Samuel stood at the counter with his arms folded, jaw working, saying nothing. Matthew hovered close and then drifted to the doorway, as if a few feet of air might make the truth easier to breathe. Daniel pulled the leather journal toward him. The first page had already knocked the wind from him. He turned the next, fingers leaving half-moons in the swollen paper. The entries began like a ledger of a young man's days. Work on the rail line, odd jobs at the cotton warehouse, Sunday services at a one-room church with soft-spoken men whose hands shook only when they put their hymnals down and walked back out into a world that kept its boot on their necks. Then the handwriting sharpened, as if the pen itself had stood up straighter. Nights in basements, lists of names and nicknames, plans drawn on butcher paper with greasy pencil. A phrase repeated so many times it seemed to hum under the lines, "Hold the line." Greenville, 1962. A courthouse step where signs rose and dogs strained at leashes. Greenville, 1963. A grocery boy's teeth knocked out for not smiling quick enough. Greenville, 1964. A riverbank vigil for Jonah, who didn't come home. Thomas recorded each year like a preacher writes down the births and deaths he can't save anyone from. Sometimes he wrote full paragraphs, heat in the words. Sometimes he left only a date and an initial, as if writing more might call down a storm. Daniel read of a deputy whose name had lived for years as a rumor too hot to touch. Caldwell. Not a man who just enforced rules, but the kind who made new ones where no eyes could see, rules that robbed dignity, ribs, breath. The journal didn't immediately swing to the night Daniel now knew must be waiting at the bottom of the pages. It walked there, step by deliberate step. Broken windows, knees on necks. A boy's bicycle found twisted in the ditch beside County Road 10. A meeting in the basement of Mount Olive Church, where the men took off their hats and didn't pray before they spoke. They laid guns on the table, old ones, heavy ones, not because they wanted to be men with guns, but because they didn't want to keep burying boys. Samuel pulled a chair out at last and sat, elbows on his knees, head bowed, like a man on the edge of a ring, listening to a bell he can't unhear. "I knew Grandpa was steel," he murmured. "I didn't know he was iron." Daniel turned another page and touched an envelope tucked there. The paper had gone translucent at the folds. Inside was a letter from Reverend Amos Green, a looping script that steadied itself every time the ink faltered. "Brother Thomas," it began, "you will be tempted to call anger courage. Do not. Courage is what the body does when it's afraid. Anger is what it reaches for when it's tired of being afraid. If you must carry for the doorways behind you, wives, brothers, sons. Not for vengeance. Not ever." Underneath someone had added in pencil, "Caldwell was at the bridge last night." A photograph slipped loose. A courtroom step in black and white, faces turned toward a man speaking whose mouth was open in mid-syllable. Thomas stood 3 shoulders back, not at the front, not hiding, eyes pinched against the glare. Daniel recognized the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He placed the photo next to the letters, then found another that lifted bile, a night scene, blurred, the outline of cars, a smear of light where a baton had been caught in motion. The date on the back matched one of the tighter entries. No confession there, only a radius of grief pressed into paper. Matthew edged closer. "Why would he keep guns?" he asked, voice soft, almost reverent, like he'd walked into a sanctuary without meaning to. "Because sometimes," Samuel said before Daniel could answer, "the world won't listen to a man unless he's holding something it fears." "That makes it right?" Matthew asked. "No," Samuel said. "It makes it complicated." Daniel kept reading. The pages hastened toward a night on Washington Avenue when folks came out with candles and the sheriff came out with dogs. Caldwell was there, helmet crooked, laughter visible even without sound. A name Daniel didn't know, Caleb Dunn. appeared 3 times with parentheses Daniel couldn't decipher. Then came a single page that made Daniel's breath catch. It was ordinary words with extraordinary weight. We held the line as long as men can hold a thing without begging it to hold them back. Caldwell took Jonah's jaw in his nightstick and said he could break it or break a promise. I saw red, and then I saw nothing, and then I saw the river. The pistol was heavy like a stove lid. I put it down and picked it up and put it down, and then I carried it like 2 hands carry a child across a burning floor. I will never write the next 3 lines because writing is an oath, and I won't take that oath. If I write it down, it becomes a map, and I will not draw anyone else a map to this. Daniel stopped reading. The kitchen light seemed too bright on the page. He could feel the weight of the revolver through the dish towel at his elbow, as if words had mass and had drifted toward metal like filings to a magnet. He closed the journal and pressed his palm flat to the cover, as if he could slow the pulse underneath the leather. The house made one of its old bones noises, the pop of a joist or the sigh of a nail lifting in summer heat, and it made all 3 men look up as if Thomas himself had shifted in his chair. Samuel leaned back and let out a breath. You think that stain, he nodded toward the freezer bag and wouldn't say the word blood, is from that night? I don't know, Daniel said, and heard how thin the words were. I think Grandpa wanted to be sure nobody ever knew for sure. The screen door creaked and steps thudded on the porch. All 3 of them moved without speaking. Daniel slid the journal into a drawer. Samuel swept letters into the sack. Matthew snatched the towel-wrapped revolver and tucked it beneath the sink like it was a spider he didn't want anyone to see or step on. Knuckles rapped against the frame. Daniel opened to find Hank Willis from 2 houses down, hands in his back pockets, chin jutting the way men jut their chin when they mean to ask the thing they're not supposed to ask. Afternoon, Dan, Hank said. Heard the old oak finally gave up. His eyes flicked past Daniel's shoulder, a bird's quick glance. Crew said it was a sight. It was, Daniel said. He stepped onto the porch and pulled the door almost closed behind him. The late sun reached crosswise through the pecans and cut the yard into stripes. The stump out there looked like a wound trying to scab. You need something, Hank? Hank cleared his throat. Just paying respects, I guess. Your granddaddy, he was Thomas. Lot of folks are thinking on him today. He hesitated, and for a half-second the nosiness softened into something like consideration. You holler if you need a hand, he added, which in Greenville meant a man was rooting around the edges of your business, but would pass you a shovel if you asked him blind. I appreciate it, Daniel said, and held Hank's gaze long enough to make it true. Hank shuffled his boots, nodded, and went. When Daniel came back to the kitchen, Samuel had already drawn the revolver out and rewrapped it tighter. Matthew stood with his fists in his pockets, like he'd practiced not fidgeting his whole short life. They're going to come, Matthew said. Aren't they? Who? Daniel asked, though he knew. Everybody. The law. The men who feel like they need to say Grandpa wasn't what they thought he was. Samuel clicked his tongue. The law will come if we call them. The men will come whether we do or don't. Daniel sat and opened the journal again, but not to read. He set his index finger on the margin and traced the indent of one line where the pen had pressed harder than on any other page. Some truths a man can't bear to tell out loud. Some truths he can't bear to lock away. Carry them like a hot horseshoe. Fast enough you don't get burned. Long enough you don't forget where you put it down. The letters offered other voices. A note from Caleb Dunn. If we stay soft at the edges, they'll keep pushing us in. A scrawl from Jonah in 64. Tell Thomas he ain't the only one who can't sleep. A postcard with nothing but a day and a single word on it. Bridge. Daniel stacked them carefully. He felt the strangest sensation, that the men who had written them were nearby, not as ghosts clanking chains, but as a pressure in the air, like humid weather before rain. Matthew finally spoke what had been loading behind his teeth. If Grandpa did something, he said, if he did it because somebody wouldn't stop hurting people, is he bad? Daniel rubbed his lower lip with his thumb. I think he was trying to be a wall for other men to stand behind. Sometimes walls have cracks. Sometimes they knock down what's in front of them to keep what's behind them from getting crushed. That ain't yes or no, Matthew said. "It ain't that kind of question," Samuel answered, gentle as he knew how. Evening pressed in. The kitchen light tugged moths against the screen like small, harmless insistences. A train sounded far off, a steel song that seemed to run underneath everything else. Daniel read on, slower now, tasting every line. There were details the papers would care about, and details no one but a son and a grandson would understand. Thomas noting the smell of shoe polish on a sheriff's boots. The way one of the deacons from Mount Olive folded his hat twice before a prayer he knew no one could answer. The way silence felt the night after the worst night. How it stuck to a man's teeth and made them squeak when he closed his mouth. A late entry, the handwriting wobblier, pulled Daniel forward to the end and then held him there. I sat under that oak because the ground under it knew what I knew and didn't say so. If I moved away, maybe I'd forget where it was buried, and forgetting is a sin I won't add to the list. If anyone is reading this besides me, it means the tree fell, or I did. If the tree fell first, then the next man will have to decide whether secrets are protection or poison. If I fell first, I reckon the tree did what it could. Daniel closed the journal. The room held still. Samuel got up and paced once to the sink and back, large hand trailing over the counter's edge like he might pry the whole kitchen up and carry it outside. "We can't just sit," he said. "Either we call, or we bury it deeper, or we burn it. Those are the only three roads I can see from here." Matthew stared at the revolver-shaped towel. "If we burn it, it's like it didn't happen. If we bury it, it's like we're the ones making it happen again," Daniel said. "And if we call," Samuel added, "it's like we're handing Grandpa to men who weren't man enough to arrest Caldwell when he breathed mean on people." Daniel stood. The chair legs rasped the floorboards, a sound he felt in his molars. He walked to the window. Outside, the stump's rings glowed pale in the last light, circles folded into circles, a cross-section of time. Beyond it, the yard opened to darkness where the oak's shadow used to be, and the yard looked wrong, raw, like a man with his hat off in church. He pressed his knuckles to the glass and closed his eyes. Thomas's voice came back not as a command this time, but as a memory of a man trying to set a boy down in the world where he could stand up straight later, take care of the place. Men in Greenville meant more than boards and dirt when they said place. He turned and faced the table. "We're not burning it," he said. "We're not burying it either." He looked at Matthew first, then Samuel. "I need to read it all once, so I know what I'm handing over. Then we call." Samuel opened his mouth to argue, and didn't. He scratched the back of his neck and nodded once, because a man can disagree and still know what the right road looks like when he sees it. Matthew let out the breath he'd been holding. He reached instinctively for the journal, then drew his hand back and stuffed both fists deep in his pockets again, an act that made him look like every boy on the edge of becoming a man in every town that ever had a river and a feed store. They ate late. Biscuits left over from morning, cold chicken Samuel had brought wrapped in wax paper, slices of tomato laid out on a plate that had belonged to Thomas, and had a crazed web of tiny cracks across the glaze like the skin of old hands. No one said much. After, Samuel stretched on the sofa, one arm over his eyes. Matthew climbed the stairs and stopped halfway to look back down at his father. Daniel could not tell whether his boy was asking a question or giving him an answer with that look. He nodded either way. When the house had quieted and the insects took up their steady outside hymn, Daniel opened the journal again and read from the first line through to the last without stopping. He read the words of a man who had been two things at once, and had known he was two things at once, and had chosen silence, not because he loved it, but because he was afraid of what sound might call down from the hills. He read the names and the dates, and the ache and the little moments that made the big ones bearable. He read until the room thinned to the lamp and the paper, until his eyes burned and his mouth went dry, until the last entry trembled under his hand and the leather cover warmed to his palm. Then he stood, slid the journal into the drawer where Thomas had kept the good screwdriver, and turned off the light. The dark did not feel empty. It felt like something had finally decided which way it meant to lean. He slept badly, but he slept. When Son found the kitchen, he was already on his feet, the phone in his hand. He looked out at what the oak had left behind and saw not a wound but a decision. He dialed. The ring sounded like the slow tick of a long clock. When a voice answered, he said his name, his address, and the words that would turn the house into a place other feet would walk and other hands would touch. There's something you need to see. The police arrived the same afternoon. Daniel made the call. 2 patrol cars rolled up the gravel drive, and the quiet of Greenville seemed to fold itself around the moment. Samuel stood on the porch with his arms crossed. Matthew leaned against the rail, eyes wide. Daniel met the officers at the door and led them inside, where the bag and its contents lay waiting on the kitchen table. Gloved hands lifted the revolver, the knife, the cloth. Letters were laid out, photographs studied. The journal opened briefly but closed again with respectful precision. The officers asked questions, steady and professional, how the items had been found, whether Thomas had ever spoken of them, who might know about the discovery. Daniel answered honestly. His voice stayed calm, but inside every word felt like betrayal. One of the officers, older and softer in tone, touched Daniel's shoulder. It took courage to call. Secrets like these don't stay buried forever. Better you carried it into the light than your boy stumble on it alone. When the cruisers pulled away with evidence boxed in the trunk, the yard felt hollow. Word spread through Greenville in less than a day. Neighbors whispered in barbershops and diners. Some called Thomas a hero, others muttered that he was dangerous. Old rumors resurfaced about Deputy Caldwell, about nights when blood was spilled and silence paid for peace. For every man who lowered his eyes in shame, another nodded with quiet respect. Samuel said little, but Daniel could see the storm brewing in him. Matthew asked again and again if Thomas was a good man or a bad one. Daniel gave the only answer he could. He was both, like all of us. Weeks passed. Investigators came and went, asking more questions, photographing the yard, collecting soil samples near the stump. Daniel cooperated, but he held something back. He had not surrendered everything. The journal stayed in his keeping, along with one photograph of Thomas standing firm among other men who had risked everything. It wasn't dishonesty, it was preservation. He wanted Matthew, and someday Matthew's sons, to know their ancestor not only by the stain of one violent night, but also by the unyielding courage of a lifetime. Greenville adjusted slowly. Some men spat when they said Thomas's name, but others tipped their hats when they passed Daniel on Main Street, as if acknowledging the weight he carried. Samuel reminded him often that choosing truth was like setting down a heavy sack. You didn't feel lighter right away, but at least your hands were free. One evening, Daniel stood at the stump, its raw surface weathering under rain and sun. Matthew came running with a young maple sapling purchased from a roadside nursery. Samuel brought a spade. Together the 3 of them planted it in the shadow of the scar the oak had left behind. Soil clung to their hands, sweat darkened their shirts, but when they stepped back, the sapling stood straight and trembling in the evening breeze. Daniel brushed dirt from his palms and whispered words he hadn't prepared. The old tree carried secrets. This one carries hope. He didn't know if Matthew heard, but Samuel gave a single nod. That night, Daniel tucked the journal into a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. He knew one day Matthew would read it. He hoped his son would see not only the shadows, but also the light. See Thomas not as a monster or a saint, but as a man who had fought, faltered, and carried burdens that finally had to be shared. The oak's shadow was gone from the yard. In its place was the fragile outline of something new, something that might one day grow tall enough to shade future generations, not with silence, but with truth.